Hello, Terry Lynch here, medical doctor, accredited psychotherapist, best-selling mental health author, creator of mental health courses for mental health professionals and the general public. Today I want to speak to something that I consider to be very important, the medicalization of human distress in relation to suicide and suicidal thoughts. This video is primarily for mental health professionals such as psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, but people who are genuinely interested in learning about mental health may also be interested in this video. This is an article on suicidal risk and mental disorders. The contents of this article typify the prevailing perspective in relation to suicide. The authors write, most suicides are related to psychiatric disease, with depression, substance use disorders, and psychosis being the most relevant factors. However, personality, eating, and trauma-related disorders, as well as organic mental disorders, also contribute. Most people who have died by suicide have suffered from mental disorders. A recent figure suggests this number could be at least 90% of people who have died by suicide. The risk of suicide has been estimated to be 5 to 8% for several mental disorders, such as depression, alcoholism, and schizophrenia. So, according to the prevailing mental health paradigm, up to 90% of suicides are primarily due to mental illness. This is a seriously incorrect perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher. In relation to suicide, he once wrote, "It will generally be found that as soon as the terrors of life reach the point where they outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life." If I was writing this, I would change pieces of it. I don't think it's the case that a man or woman will put an end to his life, but in such circumstances, where the terrors of living outweigh the terrors of dying, thoughts of ending one's life may certainly arise within. Thoughts of ending it all may, and commonly do, arise within if, when, living, being alive, becomes unbearable. This makes sense. The psyche, the being, reads the situation that they find themselves in, sees that there aren't many, indeed, from their perspective, perhaps there aren't any that they can see, realistic ways forward or solutions that they can see, that they can believe in. Therefore, ending it all may understandably surface within them as a way, often as they see it, the only way to end the excruciating pain that they are experiencing and may have lived with for years. The primary aim is not to kill oneself. The primary aim is to kill the pain. And in such situations, the only way that seems possible to kill the pain is to kill oneself. And in such circumstances, to end the excruciating and intolerable pain they are experiencing, the only option that seems open to them at that point of their lives may be to end themselves. There's a major distortion going on here. Very high levels of wounding results in overwhelming levels of distress that may prompt within the person thoughts of suicide as often the only way to end the pain, the torment that they're experiencing. What is actually going on, people who have experienced very high levels of wounding in their lives, in the world, this wounding can result in overwhelming levels of pain, of distress, that may prompt thoughts of suicide as and sometimes the only way from the person's perspective as they see it, to end the pain. What we are told is going on within the predominant mental health paradigm in relation to suicide is that suicidal thoughts, suicidal actions, are caused by mental illnesses in 90% of cases, as we saw in an earlier slide. For example, it is commonly determined that depression or some other psychiatric diagnosis caused or drove the person to it, to ending their lives, not their excruciating pain, torment, overwhelm, etc. So that's what we are told is going on. But what is actually going on is the systematic medicalization of human distress. Here are the opening paragraphs of my 2001 bestseller book, Beyond Prozac, all of which still completely applies today. Emotional distress is one of the greatest epidemics of our time. As sometimes happens in epidemics, those afflicted are ostracized. Emotions are a fundamental part of the human condition, But in modern society, there is little tolerance for the expression of emotion. When friends or loved ones become angry or tearful, we want them to stop because we do not feel comfortable with painful emotions. The greater the distress, the more uncomfortable we feel. We reach a point where we cannot, if I was writing the book now, I would add, will not, listen anymore. We find ways of repackaging emotional distress to make it more palatable. This allows us to distance ourselves from the epidemic. The main repackaging process society uses is to classify emotional distress as so-called mental illness. Another term that is equally accurate to the term repackaging would be sanitizing. Merriam-Webster Dictionary definition of sanitize. To make something, such as text, more acceptable by removing, hiding, or minimizing any unpleasant, undesirable, or unfavorable parts. In relation to the topic we're considering here, sanitizing refers to the reconstruction of people's immense, intolerable, unbearable torment, distress, overwhelm, and other equally intolerable emotions that brings people to have suicidal thoughts or to the brink of suicide or to act upon these thoughts, and instead distort these into perspectives of mental illness. This is a real sanitization and distortion of the truth. Both repackage and sanitize constitute distortions of reality, distortions of truth. You see, a major part of my objection, serious objection, to suicidal thoughts, suicide being put down to so-called mental illnesses such as depression, stems from my 25 years of major research into mental health, the psychiatric diagnoses, and working with hundreds, if not thousands of people who have been given psychiatric diagnoses from a psychotherapeutic perspective. I am a medical doctor as well, but I decided over 20 years ago that I wanted to work psychotherapeutically, and I retrained as a psychotherapist. I'm going to give you one example now of why I became so distrustful of notions of psychiatric diagnoses such as depression being valid, verified medical illnesses, medical diseases. Depression is not a scientifically verified, scientifically confirmed medical illness, medical disease, brain disease. In my best-selling book, Beyond Prozac, first published in Ireland in 2001, published in Britain in 2004, I questioned to quite a major degree the current predominant paradigm in relation to the psychiatric diagnoses. In this book, I wrote the following in relation to the criteria for a diagnosis of depression. Why did the American Psychiatric Association select 5 criteria as the magic figure? 5 criteria for a diagnosis of depression. What is the difference between a person who meets 6 criteria and is therefore diagnosed as having a major depressive episode and needing antidepressant treatment, and one who meets 4 criteria and therefore receives no psychiatric diagnosis or treatment? Why 5 criteria? Why not 3 or 7? How valid are these criteria? I know the answers to these questions myself. These criteria have no scientific validity whatsoever. 9 years after my book, Beyond Prozac, was first published, Dr. Daniel Carlett, an American psychiatrist, his book entitled Unhinged, The Trouble with Psychiatry, A Doctor's Revelations About a Profession in Crisis. The title alone tells you a lot. In this book, Dr. Carlett recalls questioning Dr. Robert Spitzer, the lead psychiatrist of the 1980 DSM-3, a landmark DSM within which the understanding and criteria for a diagnosis of depression which still pertain were first set out. Daniel Carlett had questions just like I did, but he took them a step further. He questioned Dr. Robert Spitzer. Daniel Carlett to Robert Spitzer. How did you decide on 5 criteria as being your minimum threshold for depression? Exactly the question I had asked 9 years earlier. Robert Spitzer replied, it was just consensus. We would ask clinicians and researchers, how many symptoms do you think patients ought to have before you would give them a diagnosis of depression? And we came up with the arbitrary number of 5. So it was just consensus. They asked clinicians and researchers casually, randomly, nothing scientific here whatsoever. And they came up with the arbitrary number of 5. Daniel Carlett, not satisfied with these answers, questioned Robert Spitzer further. But why did you choose 5 and not 4? Or why didn't you choose 6? Robert Spitzer replied, because 4 just seemed like not enough, and 6 seemed like too much. Think about that for a minute and just ask yourself, how scientific was this process? Daniel Carl continued in his book. Spitzer smiled impishly as he uttered the last sentence above. As I've set out elsewhere in other videos and in courses, depression is not a scientifically or medically verified medical condition, medical illness. The same is true for bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, OCD, all of the psychiatric diagnoses. The experiences and behaviors are real for sure, real and often very, very painful, difficult. But extrapolating that these experiences and behaviors constitute verified medical illnesses is simply not supported at all by the scientific evidence. So coming back to the question we were asking at the beginning of this video, is it right to consider suicidal thoughts, suicidal feelings, suicide itself, as simply the product of mental illnesses? The mental illness is the problem. Treat the mental illness and everything will be fine. Clearly, that is not the right approach. I'm in the process of creating a course for mental health professionals such as psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, on working with people with a psychiatric diagnosis. A major part of that course will be setting out trauma-informed and psychologically informed understandings and explanations for the experiences and behaviours which come to be diagnosed as various psychiatric diagnoses, which come to be mistakenly, erroneously described as brain disorders, which they are not. They are trauma-related and psychologically related situations. If you would like me to update you about when this course becomes available, contact me below, message me below this video, and I will make sure that you are kept up to date as to when the course will be available. I'm creating this course to coincide with an article with the same title that I've written for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy's journal, Healthcare Counselling and Psychotherapy Journal. My article will be published in the October 2025 edition of that journal. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.